Good morning if you're with us here in Western Australia in Perth. Good afternoon if you're signing in from Sydney. My name is Gordon Flake. I'm the CEO of the Perth USAsia Centre, and it's my great honor to welcome you to the seventh, and for this year at least, final in our ongoing series of reviews of the United States political situation, a U.S. politics review that we've been doing since June jointly with our partners at the United States Studies Center. This has been from the very beginning a wonderful opportunity for myself as CEO of the Perth USAsia Center to interact with Professor Simon Jackman, who's the CEO of the United States Studies Center, and to bring to you, our community, a number of guests, observers, experts on developments over the last 6 months. And now as we wrap up 2020, although it doesn't seem like 2020 is entirely done with us yet, this is a wonderful opportunity for Simon and I to reflect back on what's happened thus far, the state of play today, and to look forward to developments in 2021. So let me begin by, as is our tradition at the Perth USAsia Center, acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, virtual though it may be, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and are delighted to be at the University of Western Australia, which affords us this opportunity that we've had for the last 7 years of our existence. Because we have been alternating hosting of this monthly discussion, I've drawn the long straw. I got lucky today, and that I'm acting as kind of moderator, as a host, and that means I get to just drill Simon with a lot of questions and then opine on the sidelines. But in that, we've been very fortunate to partner with the United States Studies Center. There really is no organization in Australia, and arguably no organization anywhere in the Southern Hemisphere or within the Indo-Pacific more broadly that has paid closer attention to political developments, to security developments, to economic developments in the United States, and in understanding their implications, not just for us here in Australia, but for the Indo-Pacific. And that's no surprise, given that the United States Studies Center is led by Professor Simon Jackman. I think you all know him well. His long tenure of over 20 years at Stanford University means that he brought with him back to Australia this tremendous level of expertise on American politics, which his center, the United States Studies Center, has benefited tremendously from, but our broader community, not just in Perth, but now that we have an audience in this virtual world that extends throughout the region, to India, to Japan, to Indonesia, and beyond, to share that. So Simon, thank you for this partnership. We've really enjoyed the last 7 months in discussion. And I just wanted to kick off by again thanking you, not just for the partnership, but by your bringing on this extended network of individuals. If I reflect back over the last 7 months, we've had some tremendous guests join us for this monthly conversation. Former congressional candidate Evelyn Farkas, former member of Congress and one of your senior fellows, Mia Love, former U.S. Senator Jeff Flake, your own expert in your Senator Gorana Gergic, Chelsea Martin, former consul general to LA, as well as former Ambassador Jeff Blyce, and others. Mark Texter, tremendous pollster, et cetera. So we've had a lot of expertise. I thought we might want to kick on the conversation before jumping right into the here and now and asking you to just kind of reflect back. In the again, 6+ months that we've been doing these discussions, are there any reflections you've had in the conversations where somebody who was our guest got it exactly right, or that you're reflecting back on, or got it wrong, or insights that we had to pull forward to our conversation today as we kick off?
Well, Gordon, first of all, before I answer that, let me just thank you for that extraordinarily generous introduction. Thank you for that. And on behalf of the center as well, not just myself, but and yeah, it's been a great partnership and great way to end it for the year at least. And we'll see what the new year brings with keeping these events rolling forward. Trump may be disappearing from the White House at some point soon, but the missions of our two centers remain extremely top of mind for Australia and for people joining us around the region. So I think there's quite an appetite for us to continue some form of this monthly check-in next year, and we'll see what that brings. But to return to your question, look, Gordon, I keep going back to the Jeff Flake conversation we had with Gorana, we're literally an hour later, we got the news that Trump had been diagnosed with COVID. It was just like, you've got to be kidding. Like, could this year get any crazier? And I think it was Garana that was saying, there's more surprises yet. And
You picked the October surprise for sure, no question.
yeah. And I remember getting an email from Senator Flake literally about an hour later, the usual thank you for your time, Senator, and that was great. And then we're just all reacting to this news. It was really crazy. And again, the immediacy of this medium, like we could be in real-time conversation with Senator Flake there in Arizona and reacting to this news across the time zones that span all the way from Perth to in that case, to Arizona. I guess the other thing I'd single out is that Mia Love, who I guess it was 50-50. I guess when we had her on the call, she was very down on President Trump. And, it's been a constant sort of theme from Mia that Trump has taken the party away from its, the Reagan-led or the vision of a Republican Party pursuing the aspirations and the image laid out for it in the age of Reagan. She sort of noted, as Senator Flake for that matter, there's been a real break from that. And yet on election day, Mia tweeting out that she'd voted for Trump. And I think I might look forward to perhaps a follow-up conversation with Mia as to, and perhaps a few other people as well. The flip side of that would be not a talk we did in this series, Gordon, but another event we co-hosted, and that was the John Bolton conversation, where Bolton, again, I think of a similar mindset to some extent, that Trump is not a real conservative and he's doing untold damage to the national interests of the United States. But although he said he wouldn't be voting for Trump, he wouldn't be voting for Biden either. And I think Jeff Flake was in that camp. No, Jeff came out and actually said he was going to vote for Biden. So it was really interesting to watch, I guess, those three Republicans sort of land in different places with respect to their vote. And it was great to get those voices.
I think you put your
over the course of the year.
I think you've put your finger on something that we're going to be discussing a lot going into next year, and that I'm hearing from a lot of the community here in Australia, and that is, one way or the other, now it looks like 75 million Americans will have voted for Donald Trump. And so kind of breaking that down and getting some understanding as to what percentage of those were kind of MAGA hat wearing, rally attending, full on for Donald Trump, supporters, others like Mia who were reluctant or perhaps voting on abortion, et cetera, others who might arguably one way or the other have supported the Republican Party, but not the president. It's going to be really interesting for us to kind of slice and dice that, and it's going to have real implications for the success of the Biden administration going forward. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. I think it's probably sorry, Gordon. I was just going to say, I think it's probably one of the biggest questions about the future of American politics right now. Trump, while a defeated one-term president and joining a very short list I'm just looking at the list right now. It reads Gerald Ford, Donald Trump, Jimmy Carter, Herbert Hoover, George Herbert Walker Bush, and Taft in what is that at the bottom? 1912, yeah. It's a very short list in the last 120 years. Yeah,
I think you have to add John Adams and John Quincy Adams. If you
I was just going back 120. I made 1900 my cutoff on this, but
fair enough.
But he does so, Gordon, unlike those other presidents. A hallmark of Trump's time in office was this extraordinary polarization that's been growing in American politics, but went to a high watermark under Trump with his approval rating among Republicans on election eve at 95%. And Jimmy Carter did not have a 95% approval rating among Democrats as he loses to Ronald Reagan in 1980. And Trump leaves office with this stock of political capital and a connection to a hardcore base of supporters, he leaves office with political capital that no one else on that list had as they left office. Of at least of the 20th century and 21st century presidential losers, and what he chooses to do with that political capital. Add to the fact that the Republicans ate into the Democratic majority in the House. The Democrats did not flip the Senate, and we can talk about what we think might happen in Georgia. But it puts Trump, therefore, I think, in a position of power over his party for a president leaving office under these circumstances we haven't seen in political memory and in the United States. And I think the ball is in his court, so to speak. Is it a straight monetization play? Is it a play for influence over the party heading into the 22 midterms and setting him up for a run in 24, or all of the above? I think a lot of the trajectory of American politics, Trump still has cards to play.
Although I might add a little bit of a counterpoint to that. I saw just this morning a listing of the percentage of the popular vote that each president in this century has received. And Barack Obama in 2008 was at the peak, 52.3%. Joe Biden's victory is actually the second highest popular vote total in this century at nearly 52%, 51.9% right now. And at the very bottom is John McCain in 2008 at 45%. Interestingly enough, in his two elections, both one he won and now the one he's lost, President Trump got 46.1% in 2016 and I think 46.9% this time, behind even Mitt Romney's 47%. And so that's another way to kind of look at that as a percentage of the overall popular vote. He may have had 90%, 95, 96% of Republicans, but they accounted for a smaller percentage of the electorate. And as a result, as an overall percentage, even in victory, was among the lowest this century. So anyway, hey, we could go on these. I want to come back to the conversation we had with Mark Texter, but that'll be in a separate conversation on polling. I do have to give a shout out to my home state of Arizona. It was kind of fortuitous that we did have the former senator from Arizona, Jeff Flake, on the program, and it turned out that Arizona proved to be such a turning point, if not in the final total, in the narrative on election night itself. And so that obviously, you got to call out your hometown friends in that regard. Let's turn to the state of the transition. We've spent a lot of time this year talking about the state of the race. The race ostensibly is over. The president-elect has been recognized broadly, although not yet by the institutions of the Republican Party, but internationally. Next week on the 8th of December, all states are required to have selected their electors. By the 14th of December, the Electoral College actually formally casts their votes. And then by the 6th of January, those votes will be tabulated by the House of Representatives. So that's the state of the transition, but this has been a transition like no other. I might want to just get you to start there. What is the state of the transition, and what are you watching there?
Well, I think the single biggest thing to note over the last 72 hours or so was Bob Barr, the Attorney General, Trump's Attorney General, saying the Justice Department has found no significant fraud. Every 48 hours or so, and sometimes every 24 hours, there's another sort of nail in the coffin, as it were, just underscoring the certainty of this result. And the rest of the world moved on very quickly. And slowly but surely, I think people around Trump and Trump himself are coming to realize what's going to happen here. I think that's an important point, and one that's been, I think, settled for quite a while. And again, like all things Trump, what's rhetoric and a play for his continuing prominence in the national conversation, monetization or influence, or both, being the goals there, perhaps. But so the election is over. I think we can move on and talk about not so much the legal formalities, which I think they will result in being that, as they typically are, legal formalities, and not moments of constitutional high drama. They'll be the former, not the latter, as has always been the case, again, in the last 150 years or so. And then we can talk about the transition in the ordinary sense. We typically use that word, Gordon, and that's how is Biden staffing up and putting together a new administration, and what will their priorities be? And I think that's where a conversation about Australia's national interests start to sort of take firmer shape, rather than a conversation about how will a close ally deal with constitutional and political uncertainty. I think that is now firmly receding into the rearview mirror, and we can have a much more normal transition conversation.
So I want to get to the transition in terms of personnel, but there's several other things that come before that. We've got a special runoff election in Georgia. Before we talked about Georgia, though, let me just kind of opine. One of the things that's really been shocking for me as someone who was born and raised in the United States is how much this much vaunted system of checks and balances in the United States system turned out to be largely based on the honor code, right? It's been a really interesting year where things that you assumed nobody would ever do, no politician would ever do, whether it's the emoluments clause or a whole range of issues, all of a sudden, in the end, if you end up having an individual who's not willing to abide by them, the system isn't quite as robust as you might expect, except for one very important exception, and that has been the courts. When you look at the relationship between the legislative branch and the executive branch over the last 4 years, that's one where we were actually quite surprised that the legislative branch under Donald Trump really has not asserted their prerogative as an Article I party to the Constitution, an Article I power with independent responsibilities. They've largely functioned as the party of Trump. The courts, on the other hand, have been a little bit more robust, and I think we're seeing that play out in the transition as well. It's quite remarkable to me that I think we're now 43 to 1, right? And all the various different motions that the Trump campaign or transition, however you want to phrase it, his lawyers have filed in courts. The only one that has been successful was a day after the election, and that was in an individual county in Pennsylvania where they wanted to change the deadline for when late ballots could be received from 9 days down to 6 days. And that's the only one they won. Every other motion that they have filed has been knocked back by the courts. And that, to me, highlights a really important divide in our modern society as we wrestle with what are facts, right? Because traditionally we thought the media would be an arbiter of facts, but the media environment has become so highly partisan. Everybody chooses to use the term of Kellyanne Conway, their own facts, right? Their own alternate realities in that process. But when it comes to a court of law, when you have to be sworn in and there are penalties for lying, it turns out that's a very different standard than a 46-minute speech given by the president that he tapes himself and releases. Or by a speech given in front of a lawn and gardening home improvement center in suburban Pittsburgh or Pennsylvania, rather Philadelphia, by the president's lawyers. So that's a really interesting development for me in terms of the transition. That important role of the judicial system in upholding those standards and norms. Any thoughts of you, Mio, on that front?
Yeah, real quickly, Gordon. Just on Congress, I would point out Trump did lose the House. In the Republicans lost the House on the back of century high turnout in the midterm election, and then a Democratic-controlled House of Representatives impeached Trump. So that happened. So to some extent, the constitutional machinery worked as per standard, as by the book. We had a free and fair midterm election. There was extraordinarily high turnout. There was an accountability moment. The party, at least in one chamber in control, changed. And they availed themselves of the constitutional provisions open to them, the ultimate sanction for an American president, and that is the impeachment process. Now, the Senate did not vote to convict. One Republican senator, though, Mitt Romney did vote for conviction. That's unprecedented as well. So I just put that on the table. And then the other thing is, it's just a general observation, Gordon. All through the Trump presidency, it's been a stress test, as we've often said, of American political institutions. But it's, for me, intellectually, it's been, what do we mean by that? Will the institutions hold? And it's something I've come to, over my sort of adult life, using the word institutions as a scholar, for the last 30 years. What do we mean? What is an institution? And at the end of the day, it's people. And you said the honor code. Well, institutions work when people remain committed to them. It's those, we talk about the courts, but there are judges making those decisions with extraordinary discretionary power. And time again, even conservative judges, Republican judges, they made decisions about the role of evidence in their courts. They made decisions about the nature of the remedy that was being sought by the Trump campaign against the evidence and the legal arguments that the Trump attorneys were able to bring to court. And so I'm reminded at this moment, when we talk about the institutions holding or the courts doing their job, that at the end of the day, there are flesh and blood human beings with consciences and enmeshed in social environments of their own that are making these decisions that collectively add up to saying, quote, the system worked or the institutions held. And as someone that teaches people that go into those careers, not so much now running the US Study Center, but certainly at Stanford, I think those of us in thought leadership or as teachers of people, as mentors of people going to those extraordinarily important roles in government, in the military, in legal careers, I think moments like the last 4 years have only served to underscore sort of the important role that we have. These institutions are not set and forget. They are replenished by the next generation, and what they carry with them in their conscience and in their minds is extraordinarily important. I think that's an important takeaway for me, not just from the last 4 years, but from any period you'd care to look at in political history, almost in any democratic country.
Your focus on institutions and the individuals that staff them make me want to comment on the American system. We've already had several questioners on our chat function here raising questions about, why does the United States not have a national electoral commission in the same way Australia does? Why is it so bifurcated? And I anticipate you, like me, over the course of the last year, have fielded many, many questions from Australians who just can't quite understand how relatively balkanized or chaotic the U.S. system is, where every state's a little bit different. Even in some states, within states, counties do it differently. And on the one hand, that's considered to be, from an Australian perspective, a relative weakness, or at least something difficult to understand from the U.S. But international observers in this election came away actually quite highly complimentary of how the United States handled this election in the middle of a pandemic, which was unlike Australia, not under control. Moving to kind of mail-in ballots for the first time ever, every state doing it a little bit differently. And a very important thing to remark on is among the people in American society that deserve tremendous praise today are the local level, county, state by state, electoral commissions, those who are counting the votes. If you look at the last 4 weeks in this ongoing legal battle being waged by the president and his legal team, generally, the most vocal voices against him and his team have been Republicans in Republican-run states who take great pride in that bipartisan process, which has been established on, a city and a county and a district and a precinct level of how they work together to count and monitor and assure the election is free and fair. And again, we've seen just in the last week some rather impassioned Republican, state level leaders, calling out the dangerousness of casting dispersions upon them and their part in effort. And it's useful to remember how much effort has gone on their part to kind of make this thing happen in the United States. So
the unsung heroes of democracy, Gordon, in the American system, given the absence of a national coordinating body like the Australian Electoral Commission, it falls on the soldiers, on the shoulders, pardon me, of these in many cases, in some cases professionals, but in many cases half professional, part-timers, or in some cases just straight up volunteers at the state and local level, that I think also were determined not to have their state or their county become Palm Beach from 2000, or Broward County from 2000. And moreover, I think also a lot of the alarm bells being run by the intelligence community about foreign interference, and I think a lot of preemptive action that went on in the 4 years leading up to this election to harden up some of the back end systems, but to ensure that 2020 would be a free and fair election, and indeed that assessment from the gentleman that was charged with the cybersecurity inside the administration, declaring that they gave the election a clean bill of health from a cyber electronic warfare sort of perspective, if you like, and then Trump promptly dismissed him for his troubles only a day or two later. But there's a lot of work went into making this election free and fair. And I agree with you too, Gordon. I was struck by how well it worked, given many places were doing mail voting for the first time, and maybe it suggests that that's actually not a bad way to do it, versus having to find your precinct and get to it on election day. Extraordinarily sort of high hurdle for a lot of people. One that Australians don't have to contend with. You can vote almost anywhere in Australia.
We should also give some compliment to how vibrant the democracy is, right? I mean, if anything defined the 2016 election, it was relative apathy in terms of overall turnout. But this one, particularly previous Obama voters who did not turn out for Hillary Clinton. But it looks like that Biden is going to hit 81 million votes, which is just a stunning number in terms of that. I don't know the final number, but you'll probably have a better feel for it. But I think you're going to get close to 67% turnout, which for the United States will be the highest in a century. So engagement in democracy is certainly a good thing. And to do so in the current environment in the United States, particularly given the obstacles that were thrown in the path of many voters in states like Georgia, where they had to wait in line for 8-9 hours or so, is a tremendous thing that I think probably should be recognized and celebrated.
No, well said, Gordon, well said. And for that to happen in the middle of a pandemic, remarkable. It was presaged by the turnout boost in 2018. That was a tidal wave. That was essentially high turnout for a midterm election.
Indeed.
I'm just looking at the data on my screen right now. In the 2018 midterm, it looks like the turnout in the general election of 2020. You've got to go back to 1900, 120 years to find a turnout rate higher than the one and we're down to the last decimal point or so now, but probably end up being right around 67 by the time we're done. Just remarkable.
And if I understand, the 1920s was a very different democracy, where kind of party bosses would go out and round up people out of their houses forcibly to force them to vote. So
if you want to keep your job at the post office, you know what to do next Tuesday. Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Speaking of the peculiarities of the system, there's one state in the United States that has a runoff system, right? Where if it's first past the post, but if you don't get 50% of the vote, you've got to go to an automatic runoff. And so that means that for some people, at least for one state, the 2020 election is not over.
Not over.
In the state of Georgia, you've got 2 runoff elections, which could very well determine the balance of the Senate. So you want to give us a little bit of insight in terms of what's happening in Georgia now, and perhaps more importantly, what you think is likely to happen to Georgia, because I think that election is scheduled for the 5th of January. So that's between the inauguration.
That's right. So Georgia and Louisiana have runoff requirements in their general. Lots of states have them in their primaries, but for Georgia and Louisiana, for federal office, if you don't get 50%, the top 2 contenders go through to a special election. Maine has the Australian system of preferential voting, which is in America, sometimes they call the Australian system of preferential voting that we have for House of Representatives elections. In America, they call it instant runoff voting, which when you think about it is an apt name for it, right? And we get down to a final election, two party preferred or two candidate preferred on the night or in the days immediately following the election. In the Australian version of it, in Georgia and Louisiana, it's this stop, and then the top two do it again a month later. Voting in presidential elections in France is another multi-stage. Anyway, Georgia. And fascinating in that the two Senate seats are up at the same time. One is a so-called special election to fill a resignation, and one is the ordinary 6-year term. But anyway, it means that unusually both of Georgia's Senate seats were up on the November ballot. And in one of those races, fascinating. Perdue, the incumbent who was at the end of his regular 6-year term seeking another term, he's come up short by 0.3 of a percentage point, with the Libertarian candidate getting 2.3% of the vote. So he and the Democrat will go are looking at at the election. So he's come up just agonizingly short. In the special election, that's Kelly Loeffler. Because it was a special election, people came out of the woodwork. There were 20 candidates contested the general election, and the Republican vote split between two prominent Republicans. The Kelly Loeffler, who's currently got the seat just through an interim, what we in Australia call a casual vacancy, she got 26% of the vote, and another Republican, Doug Collins, got 20%. So these races, look, ordinarily what happens with these things, Gordon, is once the presidential election is done, the air goes out of the balloon to some extent, and that turnout surge that Trump generated, particularly among Democrats, just mad keen to get rid of him, and that ultimately flipped Georgia. Do those voters say mission accomplished and stay at home now, and they're just less energized to show up in the first week of January and vote again in Senate races when the thing they were compelled to take care of, getting rid of Trump, that's done? And so that's the usual. Once the imperative of the general election is gone, both Louisiana and Georgia, the history here has been they revert to type. And reverting to type for a red state, historically red state like Georgia, my best prediction would be Republicans win. Now, it's getting awfully interesting with the Georgia Republican Party literally tearing itself apart over Trump insisting there was electoral fraud. The Republican Secretary of State, as you alluded to earlier, amazing sort of eloquence and courage, repeatedly fronting the press and saying, "Stop it! This is dangerous. You're hurting democracy. It's a threat to me and my staff, and indeed my family. Just stop what you're doing." And so the Republicans in Georgia are at war with themselves over this. Why aren't our senators supporting Donald Trump? And they just want to quietly win a special election. Thanks very much. If it was a nice low energy contest, they will sail back. They will sail into back to Washington. And so they're between a rock and a hard place. And now Trump is coming to the state this weekend, and it's Donald Trump. So is he going to talk about himself? Probably. Or is he going to say, the most important thing now is that we send 2 Republicans back, and so we give Mitch McConnell a majority and Republicans a majority to stand up to Joe Biden? Is Trump going to make that party building speech, or is he going to make a Trump I was robbed speech? I'll leave it for people to speculate on that, but it is certainly making. Oh, and moreover, Trump coming back to the state energizes Democrats again. Like, he's back. I thought we got rid of this guy. So that's the other wrinkle here. It like all things to do with this year, it's not quite done with this yet. We've got one more spin of the wheel, or 2 spins of the wheel with the 2 Senate races. And these Republican candidates are under all kinds of scrutiny as a result. The nation's focus has just fallen on this race. And indeed, Perdue is under every day. The New York Times has got another story about he's the most prolific stock trader among any of the sitting US senators, often involving a really fascinating piece of investigative reporting detailing his stock trades that, according to the Times, are clearly touching on companies that would fall under some of his committee responsibilities as a United States senator. And so people are starting to connect those dots as well. And so look, at the end of the day, I think they probably get back for the reasons I talked about. But Trump is this massive wild card, injecting himself back into Georgia, having lost the presidency, but with these two Senate races at stake. One that I'll be keeping an eye on all the way through to January 5.
So two observations for me on Georgia, one karmic and one broader kind of U.S. political. The karmic thing is there are two previous legislators in the United States that Trump had particular battles with. One was John McCain, the former senator from Arizona, and for many reasons, a man of high principle, which Trump had this long-standing feud with. And the other was John Lewis, a former congressman from Georgia, leader in the civil rights movement, who didn't attend Trump's inauguration and for which slight Trump never forgave him. And there is actually something that on a karmic level about the two Republican states that kind of flipped, were Arizona and Georgia, the home states of these two legislators.
I thought you were going to mention Jeff Flake there for a moment, but
Jeff Flake is alive and well. I'm happy to report.
Oh, pardon me. Okay.
In that regard. Now, the broader thing is really interesting. For Australians who are trying to understand why to date, 4 weeks now after the election, despite the overwhelming amount of evidence, despite the fact that every country with the exception of Russia now has acknowledged Biden as a presidential elect and called him, why 9 out of 10 elected Republicans haven't, why the Senate majority leader hasn't. You really can't understand that without understanding Georgia, because Georgia is largely the last chance the Republican Party has to have a direct control over lever of power in Washington, D.C. And if they lose that race, they lose the Senate. And the irony there is, I think they've probably come to the conclusion, although you've described the difficulty there, that they cannot win that race without Trump, or they certainly can't win that race if Trump is against them. So they've got to keep Trump on their side. They've got to get him engaged, which means they can't just come out and say, you've lost, go home. Because if he packs up his bags and go home, then doesn't get out his base, absent that kind of 20, nobody knows the exact percentage, but we were talking about earlier, that 20, 30% of Republicans who are Trumpists and will only turn out for Trump, it's a much harder lift for them. And so it's a real difficult position they're in. Although I agree with your conclusions, and I agree with you with how this sword cuts both ways. I mean, having Trump there activates that base, also activates the Democratic base.
Yep.
And I haven't seen an analyst yet that predicts with confidence what's going to happen in Georgia, because we just don't know. In a situation where you don't have mandatory turnout at the polls, it really is going to be a question of who actually votes without Trump himself on the ballot. So a really important development that it's going to impact a lot on the Biden administration in January. So let's move, if we could, because we're quickly burning through our time here.
Yeah, right.
To the transition.
Yeah.
Your team at the United States Studies Center has already engaged a lot of the members of the Biden transition team who have been nominated thus far. You're deeply involved in kind of policy on security, on economics, on trade, et cetera. Thus far, President-elect Biden and his Vice President-elect Kamala Harris have kind of laid out diplomatic teams, kind of administrative operational teams in terms of the White House and the vice presidential staff, and economic team. I'm curious as to your assessment of the appointments thus far, what they say about an incoming Biden administration, and then what their implications are for Australia.
Sure. So where to begin there? Look, in the main, the fact that a lot of the security international facing positions were announced first, I think is look, that's almost always the case, but really significant. I think it's where Biden himself is most comfortable, number one. His long time as VP, doing a lot of representing of the United States abroad, including coming here to Australia in 2016 when he was vice president, but his long career on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. As a vice president, you have your own foreign policy, national security team. And some of those people had been with him all the way from his time at Senate Foreign Relations. And so not really surprised to see Tony Blinken be nominated, designated to be his Secretary of State. There was a little bit of thought, would that go to Susan Rice? I think wasn't surprised to see it go to Blinken in the end. Jake Sullivan, again, not a huge surprise that he would be the national security advisor. Again, someone that a Biden lifer, pretty much, and someone whose entire career as a young man, only in his early 40s, but is basically has been, welded to Joe Biden since before Biden was vice president. So unsurprising to see him get a big job. John Kerry was everywhere with Biden over the course of the campaign and had been very prominent in media. Not surprising to see him get a big overarching role in this climate czar role. And again, I think pay close attention. The idea that a former Secretary of State has been given that brief speaks volumes to the way that the Biden team see climate change as something not just about domestic policy, but as they have telegraphed for the world to hear, is something that will suffuse right through everything they do, especially into foreign policy and security policy as well. So watch that space, that someone as prominent and with the vita of John Kerry has been given that responsibility. Avril Haines, first woman to be nominated to be Director of National Intelligence, enormously significant, and also another first, Janet Yellen, to be Treasury Secretary. We're waiting to hear what happens with SecDef, the Secretary of Defense. All the betting had firmed behind Michelle Flournoy, who the United States Study Center, we'd hosted her in a webinar not so long ago. That one has slowed down and sort of, again, this sort of palace intrigue now as to what's going on and who's up and who's down and why, and pressure from the left, pressure from the African-American community, see more faces of color in the Biden cabinet. Who knows? As someone once described to me, it's a little bit like high school politics and running for student body president, and the ups and downs and the cliques that form, and it's very tough to parse that from this distance. But sort of nonetheless curious that Secretary of Defense has not been nominated yet. What does it mean for Australia, Gordon? Look real quickly on that. It is from the perspective of, will the United States be focused on the Indo-Pacific, the mindset that I think was cemented under the Trump administration of identifying China as the single biggest strategic priority for the United States. All that remains in place with these picks. There is nothing there thus far to indicate that that is not the case. A little bit of tea leaf watching, and perhaps a little more than that. Democrats have a transatlantic bias. Republicans have a Pacific bias in their view of the world and where America's interests and foreign policy challenges lie. I think that's legitimate. But nonetheless, I think that these names that have been put forward so far, and if you've read closely or listened closely to the things they've said over the 4 years that they've been out of government, I think understanding that the Indo-Pacific is the dominant strategic theater of this generation and perhaps for a few more generations to come, I think they've been on that journey. They bring that mindset to government. I think the only question is, what form now does the policy take? Biden immediately, in an interview with Tom Friedman that was in the Times a couple of days ago, he's not going to be in a big hurry to undo any of the current Trump policy settings on tariffs. And I think that they are going to have a comprehensive, very deliberate strategy, the key words being scalpel, not sledgehammer, competition with China, not confrontation. I think Australia will welcome that. But by the same token, I don't think we can expect any significant policy traction per se, at least to the middle of 21, I would say. Gordon, you know Washington better than I do, but the pace at which a new administration can get up to speed. But given the scope of how they want a China policy and an Indo-Pacific policy to be multidimensional, comprehensive, well thought out. I don't, even though there's been a lot of prep put into that, it's hard for me to imagine, Gordon, that would get bedded down and start to see rubber hit the road with the second layer of appointments, the third layer of appointments, all the policy settings and things rolled out, and we're starting to see tangible differences out here. I would imagine back half of 21 rather than first half at the earliest.
Well, you're spot on in terms of how difficult the process is. The inauguration is not till the end of January. And then after that, you have the difficult process of getting the president's cabinet kind of Senate approved. So for most administrations, it's not until the middle of June, July, before they're kind of really up and running and staffed up with the people to run it. Although this election is a little bit weird. And a little bit weird, a lot weird. We have a current president of the United States who has largely abdicated his interest in anything other than contesting the recounts, right? So, we have 30 people, a person dying every 30 seconds of COVID. Mm-hmm. This rampant verging of the worst public health crisis in American history, and nothing coming out of the White House on that. You've got this ongoing, serious trade dispute between China and one of the United States' closest allies, Australia, and nothing coming out of the administration. So in a normal, and I went through 5 different presidential transitions in the years I lived in Washington, D.C., 6 actually, in the 25 years I was there. And during that time, it was really rare for a transition to speak out, because there was this sense of decorum, right, that until the inauguration, you didn't want to step on the toes of the current elected administration, because President Trump is president all the way up until the 20th of January. But I thought it was quite striking this week that Jake Sullivan, the designated national security advisor, came out with a really strong statement in support of Australia, noting that Australia had paid a lot in blood and treasure to maintain shared ideals and freedoms around the world, and that it was important for the United States and other democracies get behind it. For that to come out from the president-elect's campaign as opposed to the White House was a telling thing. So this is a bit strange. Let me just make 2 kind of broader observations about narratives that I hear emerging in Australia that I think are worth addressing. One was an early on narrative that somehow, because of a Biden focus on climate change, that was going to be a major area of contestation with Australia, and that was going to be bad for Australia. Yeah. No, there probably will be some points of difference on this. And I think we're going to shift from the U.S. being a laggard to the U.S. being very proactive on this front. I'm skeptical that will become a major irritant in the relationship. At a broader level, if you step back, my view is that Australia in modern history has become one of the most proactive, full-throated advocates of multilateralism in the history of the planet. We love international institutions and standards and norms and organizations and multilateralism in all of its glorious formats. And for the last 4 years, the United States has been rather proactive in its efforts to tear those apart. And so the spectrum for Australia-U.S. cooperation has just expanded exponentially. And so my guess is, whatever differences there may be between the current government in Canberra and the U.S. over climate change will be overwhelmed by the 99 other areas where we're now able to work with, which are definitely in our interest, that coincide with our policies and our strategies and our priorities. And so that to me is going to be interesting. The second narrative that I've heard developing here, which I think is worth addressing, is that given the likely focus of a Biden administration on repairing transatlantic relationships, mm-hmm. NATO in particular, that somehow tantamount to a reversal of the pivot towards Asia or an Indo-Pacific mm-hmm. strategy writ large. Mm-hmm. And in my view, if you listen to what the Biden campaign has said, what the people around him have said, is they recognize full well. It was even stated specifically in the statement by Jake Sullivan mm-hmm. that in order for Australia and the United States and Australia together to effectively respond to economic coercion or other challenges that are coming out of the current era in relations with China, it really requires a broader coalition. Yep. And so repairing relations with Europe, repairing relations with NATO is something that I would argue is directly in Australia's national interest, because the more you get Germany and France and the UK, and then Japan and India and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Vietnam on board, the more influence we have in advocating for that rules-based order that's been such a mantra for Australia. So those are two developments that I've caught in terms of how we're perceiving these changes. Look, we're quickly running out of time, and we can't end this conversation without delving into an area of particular expertise of yours. I made it once of calling you a pollster, which I will repent for. While not a pollster, you're someone who has more expertise on polling than most. We had a wonderful conversation with your friend and colleague, Mark Texter.
Yeah.
I think probably now 4 weeks removed from election day, things aren't looking quite so bad, but you will be fully aware that the morning after the election, there was this narrative that how could the pollsters get it so wrong? They're wrong again. What is the youth of polling? And given the intense focus on polling here in Australia leading up to, would you just kind of give us your early assessment of polling and understanding American politics?
Yes, so much of this comes back to a key institutional difference between the two countries, and that's mandatory voter turnout that we have in Australia. It means that our Australian census is a great benchmark document for any pollster, because the electorate looks a lot like what the census tells us the population looks like. And indeed, unlike the United States, that runs a census only every 10 years, Australia is running our censuses every 5 or 6 years. So that's a great fillip, as it were, two great institutional legs up that Australian pollsters enjoy. And the track record, the 2019 election notwithstanding here in Australia, the track record of Australian polling is generally a fair bit stronger than the counter one in the United States. And indeed, the other thing about the United States is we've learned over successive elections, 2000, 2016, and almost 2020, that winning the national popular vote is by the by. We understand full well that the way a presidential election is won is by winning the Electoral College, this winner-take-all mechanism, state by state. So state-by-state polling is where the action is analytically, if you will, but it's also where the error is in America. That's very hard when you overlay how different all the different states are demographically. And so when you look at the 2020 performance, look, I think I'm still looking at this myself. There are some big outlier states this time. It's less, I think, systematic in terms of the poll error, but where the polls performed especially poorly, Gordon, Iowa, Michigan, Wisconsin, a little less so in Pennsylvania. Georgia was always going to be close, and according to the polls, and guess what? Georgia was close. Florida, the polls will be off by a tolerable amount at the end of the day. But on election eve, states that have turned out to be Biden plus anywhere from line ball to +3, the poll averages were way off. They're not off by 2 or 3 points. Wisconsin, for instance, +8 on election eve. And so, and the issue, Gordon, is Trump and this ability he has to turn out people that are otherwise almost off the grid from the perspective of pollsters. They are loosely connected to the voter registration system. A pollster would look at what we know about that people living in a given household and say, those are low propensity voters. We don't, if we are able to contact them, we don't need to give them much weight in our final estimation of how this state's going to vote, because it's very unlikely that people of that demographic slice vote. But Trump turned out that group in 2016, and he turned them out again and then some in 2020 in a way that pollsters hadn't caught up with. Trump's ability to mobilize down status, whites without a college degree living outside a major metro with a tenuous voting history. Some of those people are difficult to poll in the first place, And indeed, part of that is related to their preference for Trump. One of the ways they signal their dissatisfaction with the swamp, with the status quo, is by not answering the phone, or if it is a pollster, hanging up, or even confounding a pollster. It is less to do with, I think, a shy Trump vote than it is to a misunderstood Trump vote, or a Trump vote that making like the pollsters is part of their protest, anti-establishment impulses, as it were. It's a piece of political expression itself. And that's particularly concentrated, I said, in a handful of upper Midwestern states where the poll error was especially large. One slight caveat on that is Trump did do a little better with minority voters than I think anybody was anticipating. And was that something that might have been some misreporting for a person of color to say they're actually going to vote for Donald Trump? Maybe there's a bit of shy Trump voting there, shy Trump survey responding there. But the thing about this cycle, I think 2016, we had widespread poll error, at levels that we shouldn't see statistically. It's more geographically concentrated this time, and I think pollsters have a story as to why that's the case. But the problem is they're like generals fighting the last war. And we'll have a different set of, who knows, Trump runs again in 24, we'll be in the same situation, I think. And it does suggest we need a different way of reaching these people, or measuring their political preferences in ways that the current technologies, mobile phone, trying to recruit people to join an internet panel, just clearly aren't working. And it might be, a return to good old-fashioned shoe leather, knocking on doors, which is something the campaigns themselves do when trying to mobilize people to vote that are otherwise, not particularly connected to all the things you and I are connected to, Gordon. Watching our email obsessively, consuming news about politics obsessively. We're going to vote. We're not the ones the political parties have difficulty mobilizing. It's that key elements of the Trump constituency that are flying below the radar, at least from the current set of radar that the polling industry in the United States has.
Well, I don't know about you, but despite our daily conversations on these and the tremendous work that your center has done and my colleagues have done, I end probably 2020 with more questions than I started the year with. You have this system in the United States where Donald Trump in the last election won despite losing the popular vote by 2.9 million votes, and he ended up with 306 to 223 in the Electoral College. And Biden is going to have won the popular vote by 7 million votes, and he has the exact same total of 306 to 223. There's some uniqueness there. And there's some big questions that you put your finger on already in terms of demographics, right? What is the lingering Trump effect? Do they continue? Are Arizona and Georgia, a foreshadowing of what will happen eventually in Texas and North Carolina, Florida, how those are shifting? But all of those are going to continue to be of interest to Australia because of importance to Australia. So let me end. We're right at time right now, but let me just kind of wrap up by saying I look forward to continuing this conversation with you in different formats and maybe with different focuses next year. But given the priorities that you and your colleagues at the United States Study Center are putting together for next year, why don't you just give us a bit of a preview as for 2021 for the United States Study Center? What issues do you think are most important for Australia, and where you'll be focusing? And then we'll kind of wrap up with that.
Real quickly, Gordon, right now, in real time, the Australian government has an opportunity. One administration is going out the door. The new administration is going to take some time to find its footing. The urgency of Australia's strategic challenges, as recent news over the last week or so reveal, are extremely high and paramount. Allies like Australia and Japan, I think in particular, capable, committed allies of substance, have a real opportunity to progress their national interests and the interest in engaging the Biden administration in the region through the choices that they make now and that is something the United States Study Center is broadcasting loud and clear to anybody and everybody in Canberra. It's also a critical time, and this holds irrespective. This was true under Trump. It'll find a different footing under a Biden administration. But the Australia-US alliance in particular, the government-to-government relationship, is evolving and broadening, as you well know, Gordon, in real time. The number of things the two governments are working on in response to the strategic challenges in the region are growing every day, be it critical minerals, a topic that you and Jeff Wilson have spent a lot of time on looking out there at Perth, through to critical investments in science and technology, cooperation on cybersecurity, what has historically been a defense and intelligence alliance between the two governments is broadening in its scope in ways that I think ordinary Australians don't have a lot of visibility on. But on the 70th anniversary of ANZUS in 2021, not only is this important work going on behind the scenes, as it were, inside Canberra and inside Washington, but the United States Study Center is helping, putting its shoulder to the wheel in being a source of ideas and advice on that, and monitoring developments coming out of Washington of relevance to the Australian government in this broadening portfolio of points of contact, but also amplifying the need for, I think, ordinary Australians to understand the breadth and the dynamic nature of the alliance at this point, and how it is taking on a new life. It is less and less something that defines or constrains Australian national interests and becoming increasingly a vehicle for advancing Australia's interests. As Australia, I think over the last 4 years under Trump, by the way, has got a bit of spring in its step with respect to articulating what its strategic interests are, what its policy needs are. Australia comes to this Biden administration a stronger, a more capable, a more self-confident ally than it did to the start of the Trump administration. It takes a Trump, but here we are, and it's an extremely interesting moment for anybody working in the Australian strategic affairs community, not just because we've got this transition in the United States from a Trump administration to a Biden administration, but because of these other dynamics at work. And the United States Study Center's got a front row seat and is a meaningful contributor to that evolution. And so it remains, I wish we could say it was going to be a quiet holiday break, but with the transition in the United States, it's very much game on for us, particularly those first couple of months of 2021.
Well, it was an honor to be with you in Canberra just at the beginning of last month, and I think you're exactly correct. The tremendous work that you and your team have been doing, augmented by the work that my team have been doing on the Indo-Pacific in particular, with work on India and Indonesia and Vietnam and Japan and Korea, are all of keen interest to an incoming administration in Washington, D.C. And so we look forward to partnering with you going forward to kind of help advance the national interest here in Australia and our own collective understanding of these developments. This has been a wonderful series. It's been a great pleasure, Simon. Thank you for your time and sharing your expertise. I do hope you get a little bit of a break during the holiday.
You too.
But we look forward to re-engaging in 2021. To all who have watched the series and joined us for this, thank you for your support. We look forward to engaging with you again next year. Appreciate it. Thanks.